In the scorching summer of 1867, when the dust of the Civil War still hung in the air like the ghosts of fallen soldiers, Texas found itself caught between two worlds. The old South that had died in flames, and the uncertain future that stretched ahead like an unmarked grave. The Lone Star State was a lawless place then, where Confederate veterans wandered aimlessly through towns that barely deserved the name, and carpetbaggers from the North arrived daily with pockets full of promises and hearts full of greed. It was into this atmosphere of desperation and moral decay that Judge Matthias Crawford stepped off a stagecoach in the small settlement of Perdition Creek, carrying with him a leather satchel, a worn Bible, and a reputation for bringing order to the most chaotic corners of the frontier. Crawford was not an impressive man to look at. Average height, thinning hair, and the kind of pale complexion that suggested he had spent more time indoors with law books than outdoors under the Texas sun. But there was something in his gray eyes that made even the hardest men in Perdition Creek step aside when he walked down the dusty main street. Perhaps it was the way those eyes seemed to catalog every face, every weakness, every secret sin that the townspeople thought they had buried deep enough to stay hidden. Or perhaps it was simply the knowledge that this quiet, unremarkable man carried with him the full authority of the federal government and the power to decide who lived and who died in their forgotten corner of Texas. The courthouse that Crawford claimed as his domain was little more than a wooden box with pretensions, hastily constructed from whatever lumber the town could scrape together after the war had taken everything else of value. The building sat at the center of Perdition Creek like a spider in its web, casting shadows that seemed longer and darker than physics should have allowed. Behind the courthouse, connected by a covered walkway that kept prisoners out of public view, stood what Crawford optimistically called his jail, a collection of cells carved out of the limestone foundation of an abandoned store, with iron bars that had been salvaged from a burned plantation house, and walls that wept moisture even in the driest weather. From the moment Crawford took his place behind the crude wooden bench that served as his judicial throne, the character of justice in Perdition Creek began to change in ways that made even the most hardened outlaws nervous. His sentences were swift and his punishments severe, handed down with the kind of cold precision that suggested he had already made up his mind about a man's guilt or innocence long before the first witness was called. Cattle rustlers found themselves sentenced to months of hard labor when a few days in jail had been the previous standard. Card cheats and conmen disappeared into Crawford's custody for weeks at a time, emerging, if they emerged at all, as broken shells of their former selves, speaking in whispers about experiences they refused to describe in detail. The townspeople of Perdition Creek told themselves that Crawford's harsh methods were exactly what their community needed to cleanse itself of the lawlessness that had plagued it since the war's end. They pointed to the decrease in petty crime, the way troublemakers seemed to vanish from the streets, and the general atmosphere of fearful respect that had replaced the previous chaos. But there were other changes as well, changes that people discussed only in the privacy of their homes and only in voices barely louder than breath. Strange sounds echoed from the direction of the courthouse at night. Not the normal sounds of men confined against their will, but something else, something that reminded listeners of wounded animals or children having nightmares. The wives and mothers of Perdition Creek began to notice that their menfolk returned from jury duty with haunted expressions and a reluctance to discuss what they had witnessed in Crawford's courtroom. Business at the town's single saloon declined as men found excuses to avoid gathering in groups where conversation might turn to speculation about what exactly was happening behind the limestone walls of the judge's prison. Even the children seemed to sense that something was wrong, giving the courthouse a wide berth when they played in the streets and refusing to retrieve balls or toys that rolled too close to the building's shadow. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the settlement's only physician, began to notice an unusual pattern in his practice. Former prisoners who sought treatment for injuries that didn't match the official records of their sentences. Men who had supposedly been confined for simple theft showed signs of prolonged malnutrition that suggested starvation rather than standard prison fare. Others displayed scars and deformities that could only have resulted from deliberate infliction of pain, wounds that had been allowed to fester and heal improperly as if medical attention had been deliberately withheld. When Dr. Hayes attempted to question these patients about their experiences, He was met with silence or frantic denials that anything unusual had occurred during their time in Crawford's custody. The judge himself seemed to thrive in the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that surrounded his courthouse like a toxic fog. He could be seen at all hours of the day and night, moving between the courthouse and the prison with the measured pace of a man who had important work to accomplish and all the time in the world to complete it. His pale face never showed expression, his gray eyes never revealed emotion, and his voice never rose above the conversational tone of a man discussing the weather or the price of cattle. But there was something in his very calmness that suggested depths of purpose and intention that the simple administration of frontier justice could not adequately explain. As autumn approached, and the oppressive heat of the Texas summer began to give way to cooler nights, the whispers in Perdition Creek grew more insistent and more disturbing. What happened inside those cells was never meant to see the light of day. Judge Crawford's ascension to absolute authority in Perdition Creek had been as swift as it was complete, achieved through a combination of legal maneuvering and psychological intimidation that left the townspeople feeling as though they had awakened one morning to find themselves living under the rule of a stranger, whose true nature remained hidden behind a mask of judicial propriety. The federal appointment that had brought him to their remote settlement came with credentials that seemed legitimate enough. Letters of recommendation from officials in Austin, testimonials to his legal expertise from colleagues in distant cities, and the kind of formal documentation that impressed people who had seen little of either formal education or proper government in the chaotic years since the war's end. But it was not Crawford's credentials that established his dominance over Perdition Creek. It was his gavel, and the way he wielded it like a weapon of mass destruction against anyone who dared to question his authority or challenge his increasingly draconian interpretations of justice. The wooden hammer that should have been a symbol of impartial law became instead an instrument of terror, its sharp reports echoing through the courthouse like gunshots and causing witnesses to flinch as if they had been physically struck. Crawford's sentences were delivered with mechanical precision, each punishment calculated to exceed what previous judges might have considered appropriate while remaining just within the boundaries of what federal law would technically permit. The prison that housed Crawford's victims bore no resemblance to the civilized institutions that existed in larger cities or more established regions of the country. The limestone cells had been carved directly into the bedrock beneath Perdition Creek, creating a subterranean maze of chambers that seemed designed more for concealment than for the simple containment of criminals. The walls wept constantly with moisture that carried the smell of decay and something else, something organic and unpleasant, that suggested the limestone itself had been contaminated by the activities that took place within its depths. Each cell was equipped with heavy iron shackles that had been bolted directly into the stone walls with a permanence that suggested they were intended for long-term use rather than temporary restraint. The chains were not the standard restraints that might be found in conventional jails, but custom-forged implements that seemed designed to cause maximum discomfort while preventing any possibility of escape or even significant movement. Prisoners who emerged from Crawford's custody, and many did not emerge at all, bore marks on their wrists and ankles that suggested the shackles had been tightened far beyond what was necessary for security, applied with a precision that indicated intimate knowledge of exactly how much pressure human bone and tissue could withstand before permanent damage occurred. The atmosphere within the prison complex was one of perpetual dread, maintained through a careful combination of physical discomfort and psychological manipulation that reduced even the strongest men to whimpering shadows of their former selves within days of their arrival. The cells were kept in complete darkness, except during the brief periods when Crawford himself would descend into the depths to conduct what he called consultations with his prisoners. These private meetings, which could last anywhere from minutes to hours, were accompanied by sounds that the courthouse's few permanent staff learned to ignore if they valued their own safety and sanity. Guards who worked in Crawford's prison rarely lasted more than a few weeks before requesting transfers to other duties or simply abandoning their positions without notice. Those who did speak about their experiences, usually after consuming enough whiskey to loosen their tongues and dull their fear, described a work environment that seemed designed to break down the normal human responses of compassion and mercy. They spoke of being required to follow procedures that made no sense from a security standpoint, but which seemed calculated to maximize the suffering of the prisoners under their supervision. Most disturbing were the accounts of what former guards called special sessions, nighttime meetings between Crawford and selected prisoners that took place in areas of the prison complex that regular staff were forbidden to enter. These sessions invariably involved prisoners who had shown signs of resistance to Crawford's authority, or who had attempted to maintain some vestige of dignity and defiance in the face of their increasingly desperate circumstances. Men who participated in special sessions were either never seen again or returned to their cells so fundamentally changed that they bore little resemblance to the individuals who had been taken away. The few survivors who eventually gained their freedom and left Perdition Creek carried with them stories that they shared only with trusted friends and family members, accounts of experiences that challenged every assumption about the nature of criminal justice and the limits of human cruelty. They described Crawford not as a judge who had been corrupted by power, but as something else entirely. A man who seemed to view the legal system as nothing more than a convenient mechanism for acquiring subjects for activities that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with the systematic exploration of human suffering. As winter approached and the number of unexplained disappearances continued to mount, the question that haunted the nightmares of Perdition Creek's residents became impossible to ignore. Were these punishments justice or something far more sinister? The true nature of Crawford's activities became clear only through the fragmented testimonies of those few prisoners who managed to survive their encounters with what he euphemistically termed corrective procedures. These accounts, gathered years later by investigators who had the stomach to listen to such horrors, painted a picture of systematic torture that went far beyond anything that could be justified as legitimate punishment for frontier crimes. The methods employed in the depths of Crawford's prison complex revealed a mind that had studied pain with the dedication of a scholar and the enthusiasm of an artist, developing techniques that pushed the boundaries of human endurance while stopping just short of the merciful release that death might have provided. The shackles that Crawford used were not simply restraints, but carefully calibrated instruments of agony, tightened according to precise measurements that he recorded in leather-bound journals with the methodical precision of a scientist documenting experimental results. Former prisoners described how the iron cuffs would be adjusted daily, each turn of the key calculated to increase pressure on joints and circulation until bones began to shift and crack under the relentless compression. Crawford would observe these adjustments with the detached interest of a watchmaker, fine-tuning a delicate mechanism, making notes about the rates of swelling, the changes in skin color, and the various sounds that emerged from his subjects as their bodies reached different thresholds of distress. The starvation cells represented another dimension of Crawford's systematic approach to human degradation, spaces so small that grown men could neither stand upright nor lie down fully, forcing them to exist in positions that quickly became unbearable as their strength drained away through deliberate malnutrition. These chambers were equipped with feeding slots that allowed Crawford to control not just the quantity of food his prisoners received, but its quality and timing, turning the basic human need for sustenance into another tool for psychological manipulation. Survivors describe being given just enough nourishment to prevent death while experiencing the constant agony of hunger, their minds gradually clouded by malnutrition until they began to hallucinate and lose track of time and identity. But it was the psychological torment that Crawford inflicted through his midnight tribunals that revealed the true depth of his depravity and the extent to which he had perverted the legal system he was supposed to represent. These mock trials, conducted in complete darkness with Crawford serving as judge, jury, and executioner, forced prisoners to participate in elaborate legal charades that bore no relationship to their actual crimes or circumstances. Men who had been arrested for simple theft would find themselves accused of murder, treason, or crimes against nature that existed only in Crawford's increasingly twisted imagination. The trials themselves followed no recognizable legal procedure, instead operating according to rules that Crawford seemed to invent moment by moment, creating a nightmarish parody of justice in which the outcome was predetermined, but the suffering was prolonged through endless procedural delays and appeals that served no purpose except to extend the psychological torture. Prisoners were forced to serve as their own defense attorneys, arguing cases they did not understand for crimes they had not committed, while Crawford played all the other roles in his perverted courtroom drama with theatrical enthusiasm that suggested he genuinely enjoyed the performance. Survivors described how these midnight sessions would sometimes continue for days, with Crawford maintaining the pretense of legal proceedings, even as his prisoners collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, and the psychological strain of participating in their own ritualized destruction. The judge would deliver lengthy speeches about the nature of justice, the importance of proper legal procedure, and the moral obligations that society owed to its criminal elements, all while his victims suffered in ways that made a mockery of every principle he claimed to uphold. The experimental nature of Crawford's activities became apparent through the detailed records he kept of each prisoner's responses to different forms of physical and psychological pressure. Former guards who had glimpsed these documents described elaborate charts and graphs that tracked pain tolerance, recovery rates, and psychological breaking points with the kind of scientific rigor normally associated with medical research. Crawford seemed to view his prison as a laboratory, and his prisoners as test subjects in an ongoing study of human limitations and vulnerabilities. Most disturbing were the accounts of how Crawford's methods evolved over time, becoming more sophisticated and more precisely targeted as he learned from each previous experiment. Techniques that had initially been crude applications of brute force gradually developed into carefully orchestrated campaigns of psychological warfare that could reduce strong men to babbling invalids within days of their implementation. Crawford seemed particularly interested in identifying and exploiting individual psychological weaknesses, using personal information gathered through interrogation to craft personalized torture scenarios that attacked each prisoner's specific fears and vulnerabilities. The few men who managed to escape from Crawford's custody before their sentences were officially completed carried with them not just physical scars, but psychological wounds that never fully healed. They spoke of nightmares that continued for years after their release, dreams in which they found themselves back in the limestone cells, listening to Crawford's calm voice explaining why their suffering was not only justified, but necessary for the proper functioning of civilized society. These survivors avoided traveling through Texas, refused to discuss their experiences with law enforcement officials, and lived with the constant fear that Crawford might somehow track them down and drag them back to complete whatever experiments he had been conducting on their minds and bodies. As reports of these horrors began to filter through the community of former prisoners and their families, a pattern emerged that was even more disturbing than the individual accounts of torture and abuse. Crawford was not simply punishing criminals, but actively seeking to understand the fundamental nature of human suffering, and somewhere in the depths of his prison complex, 23 men had vanished entirely, leaving behind only questions that no one seemed brave enough to ask. The mystery of the 23 missing prisoners represented the darkest chapter in Crawford's reign of terror, a puzzle that haunted the nightmares of Perdition Creek long after the judge himself had vanished into the Texas wilderness. These were not men who had simply died during their imprisonment and been quietly buried in unmarked graves behind the courthouse, though such deaths would have been horrific enough given the conditions Crawford maintained in his underground complex. Instead, they were individuals who had entered his custody according to official records, but who had somehow ceased to exist entirely, leaving behind no bodies, no documentation, and no explanation for their disappearance that satisfied either legal scrutiny or basic human logic. The list of the missing read like a catalog of frontier society's cast-offs and troublemakers. Cattle rustlers who had been caught with their neighbors' livestock, card sharps who had been too obvious in their cheating, drifters who had committed the crime of being in the wrong place at the wrong time when Crawford needed subjects for his experiments. But scattered among these predictable criminals were names that suggested Crawford's selection process followed criteria that had nothing to do with the severity of their offenses. A Methodist preacher who had publicly questioned the judge's methods, a newspaper correspondent who had been asking too many questions about conditions in the prison, a former Confederate officer whose only crime had been expressing doubts about federal authority in Crawford's hearing. What made their disappearances particularly unsettling was the meticulous way Crawford had erased them from official records, while maintaining the pretense that proper legal procedures had been followed throughout their cases. Court documents showed that each of the 23 had been sentenced according to territorial law, with appropriate penalties assigned based on their crimes and previous records. But the paperwork that should have tracked their daily lives in custody, meal records, medical examinations, disciplinary reports, release dates, simply did not exist, as if the men had vanished from reality the moment they passed through the courthouse doors. Dr. Hayes, whose medical practice required him to visit the prison periodically to treat injured guards and seriously ill prisoners, began to notice discrepancies between the number of men he observed in the cells and the number that official records suggested should have been present. His attempts to reconcile these differences through direct inquiry met with evasive responses from Crawford and outright hostility from the prison guards, who seemed to have been instructed never to discuss specific prisoners or their whereabouts with outside parties. The physical evidence of what might have happened to the missing 23 was subtle, but disturbing to those who knew what to look for. The limestone floors of certain areas in the prison complex showed stains that could not be explained through normal wear and usage, dark patches that seemed to have soaked deep into the porous stone, despite repeated scrubbing and cleaning. After heavy rains, these stains would sometimes seep to the surface, creating puddles of discolored water that carried a metallic smell familiar to anyone who had experience with slaughterhouses or battlefield hospitals. Local legends that developed around the missing prisoners suggested that Crawford had not simply executed them in conventional ways, but had subjected them to procedures so extreme that their bodies had been rendered unrecognizable or had been disposed of through methods that left no recoverable remains. Stories circulated about secret chambers beneath the official prison cells, spaces that had been excavated from the bedrock and equipped with devices that served purposes no legitimate legal system would have sanctioned. The most persistent of these rumors involved reports of Crawford being seen late at night, sometimes alone and sometimes accompanied by guards, whose loyalty had been purchased through threats and bribes, removing heavy bundles from the prison complex and transporting them to locations in the surrounding wilderness where the Texas earth was deep enough to swallow secrets permanently. Trackers who claimed to have followed these nocturnal expeditions reported finding freshly disturbed soil in areas where no legitimate reason existed for digging, though excavation attempts invariably yielded nothing more than empty holes and the lingering sense that something important had been deliberately concealed. As pressure mounted from families seeking information about their missing relatives and from territorial authorities who were beginning to investigate reports of irregularities in Crawford's administration, the question that no one dared ask directly became impossible to ignore. Why would a judge hide the very men he claimed to sentence, and what had he done with them that required such elaborate concealment? The first cracks in Crawford's carefully constructed facade began to appear in the winter of 1868, when a combination of persistent inquiry from families of missing prisoners and the arrival of federal investigators from Austin created pressure that even his elaborate system of intimidation and concealment could not entirely deflect. The territorial governor, responding to a growing volume of complaints about conditions in Perdition Creek, had dispatched a team of officials with authority to examine court records, inspect prison facilities, and interview both current and former prisoners about their treatment under Crawford's administration. The judge's initial response to this external scrutiny revealed the first signs of the paranoia and desperation that would eventually consume him entirely. Rather than cooperating with the investigation in the confident manner that might have been expected from an innocent official, Crawford became increasingly defensive and secretive, implementing new security measures around the courthouse and prison that seemed designed more to prevent observation than to maintain order. Guards were instructed to refuse access to certain areas of the facility. Court records were moved to locations where investigators could not easily examine them, and current prisoners were forbidden from speaking with anyone other than Crawford, himself and his most trusted subordinates. But despite these precautions, information about Crawford's methods began to leak out through sources that his security measures could not control. Former guards, their consciences finally overcoming their fear of retaliation, began to share accounts of procedures they had been forced to witness and participate in during their employment at the prison. These testimonies, given initially in private but gradually becoming more public as word spread that federal protection might be available, painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond what even the most suspicious investigators had expected to uncover. Marcus Webb, who had served as a guard for 3 months before fleeing Perdition Creek in the middle of the night, provided the most detailed account of Crawford's operations that investigators had yet obtained. Webb described being required to assist with what Crawford called medical examinations, but which bore no resemblance to any legitimate medical procedures that Webb had ever witnessed. These sessions involved the use of instruments that seemed designed to cause pain, rather than to diagnose illness, and Crawford would take extensive notes during each procedure, while displaying a level of enthusiasm that suggested he was deriving personal satisfaction from his subject's suffering. The most damaging revelations came from Jacob Sterling, a former prisoner who had survived 18 months in Crawford's custody before being released through what appeared to have been an administrative error. Sterling's testimony provided the first detailed description of the underground chambers that most investigators had previously dismissed as products of overactive imagination or deliberate exaggeration. He described a complex of rooms that extended far beyond the official prison cells, spaces that had been carved from the bedrock and equipped with devices that served no purpose related to conventional incarceration. Sterling's account included descriptions of procedures that challenged the investigator's ability to maintain professional detachment while recording his testimony. He spoke of being suspended from the ceiling by chains that had been designed to distribute his weight in ways that maximized discomfort while preventing death, of being subjected to temperature extremes that brought him to the edge of consciousness without causing permanent damage, and of psychological torture sessions in which Crawford would discuss the prisoner's future fate with clinical detachment, while inflicting precisely calibrated amounts of pain. Perhaps most disturbing was Sterling's description of being forced to witness Crawford's treatment of other prisoners, experiences that seemed designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance while providing the judge with opportunities to study the psychological effects of observing extreme suffering. Sterling described watching men who had entered the prison as hardened criminals being reduced to broken shells through techniques that attacked their sanity as systematically as their bodies, leaving them incapable of coherent speech or rational thought. As these testimonies accumulated and began to create a comprehensive picture of Crawford's activities, the judge's behavior became increasingly erratic and paranoid. Letters that he wrote to territorial officials during this period revealed a man who believed himself to be surrounded by enemies and conspirators, individuals who could not appreciate the important work he was conducting and who sought to undermine his efforts through ignorance and prejudice. He wrote of his dedication to advancing human knowledge through direct observation and experimentation, defending his methods as necessary for the development of more effective approaches to criminal rehabilitation. The psychological deterioration evident in Crawford's correspondence suggested that whatever had initially motivated his extreme methods had evolved into something approaching genuine madness. He began to see patterns and connections where none existed, interpreting routine administrative communications as coded threats, and viewing normal legal procedures as elaborate plots designed to destroy his life's work. His handwriting became increasingly erratic, his sentences grew longer and more convoluted, and his logic became so twisted that even sympathetic readers found it impossible to follow his reasoning. As federal investigators prepared to issue warrants for his arrest, and territorial authorities made plans to assume control of his courthouse and prison facilities, Judge Crawford made a decision that would transform him from a documented criminal into an enduring mystery. On the night of March 15, 1869, he simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the lingering sense that his reign of terror might not have ended with his physical departure from Perdition Creek. The morning after Crawford's disappearance, the people of Perdition Creek awoke to find their courthouse empty and their nightmare seemingly ended, but the relief they felt was tempered by the unsettling realization that their tormentor had managed to escape justice just as completely as he had dispensed injustice during his time among them. Federal investigators who arrived to take Crawford into custody found his office meticulously cleaned and organized, with all personal belongings removed and official records arranged with the kind of obsessive precision that suggested the judge had spent his final hours in Perdition Creek preparing for a departure he had been planning for some time. The underground prison complex that investigators had come to examine was discovered to be in a similar state of suspicious orderliness. With cells that had been scrubbed clean of the evidence of suffering that survivors had described in such vivid detail, the special chambers that witnesses had mentioned were found to be empty of the devices and instruments that had supposedly been used for Crawford's experiments, leaving behind only bare limestone walls and floors that had been washed with some substance that had eliminated the stains and odors that should have provided physical evidence of the atrocities that had been committed there. Most disturbing of all was the complete absence of any trace of the 23 missing prisoners, whose fate had remained the central mystery throughout the investigation of Crawford's activities. The investigators' thorough search of the prison complex and the surrounding grounds yielded no bodies, no personal belongings, and no evidence that these men had ever existed beyond the fragmentary records that documented their original arrests and sentences. It was as if Crawford had possessed the ability to make human beings disappear not just from life, but from history itself, erasing their existence so completely that even their deaths left no mark on the physical world. The search for Crawford himself proved equally futile, despite the deployment of federal marshals and local trackers who were familiar with every trail and hiding place in the vast Texas wilderness. The judge seemed to have vanished as completely as his victims, leaving behind no footprints, no abandoned campsites, and no sightings by travelers or settlers who might have encountered a fleeing man. Some investigators theorized that he had been planning his escape for months, establishing supply caches and safe houses that would allow him to travel great distances without leaving a trail that pursuers could follow. But as weeks turned to months without any credible leads or confirmed sightings, a different theory began to emerge among the people of Perdition Creek, a possibility that was whispered in private conversations, but never discussed openly in the presence of outside authorities. Local residents began to suggest that Crawford had not fled the area at all, but had instead found ways to remain hidden in the very landscape where he had committed his crimes, continuing to exert his malevolent influence over the community that had both feared and enabled his reign of terror. The first reports of supernatural activity around the abandoned courthouse began within days of Crawford's disappearance. Though most residents were initially reluctant to speak openly about experiences that rational minds would dismiss as products of imagination or guilt, night watchmen reported hearing sounds from within the empty building, not the creaking and settling that might be expected from any abandoned structure, but the distinctive sharp reports of a gavel striking wood with the rhythm and authority that had once terrorized Crawford's courtroom. As time passed and these reports became more frequent and more detailed, a pattern began to emerge that suggested something more than simple imagination was at work. Multiple witnesses described seeing lights moving through the courthouse windows during the darkest hours of the night, illumination that seemed to follow the pathways that Crawford had walked during his midnight visits to prisoners who had been selected for special treatment. The lights were not the warm glow of oil lamps or candles, but something colder and more focused, as if they were cast by sources that had no need for fuel or flame. Even more disturbing were the sightings of figures moving through the ruins of the prison complex. Pale shapes that observers could glimpse only at the periphery of their vision, but which seemed to move with the same measured pace that Crawford had displayed during his years of authority in Perdition Creek. These apparitions were always seen alone, never in groups, and they seemed to be following routes that corresponded to the pathways between the cells and the mysterious chambers that investigators had found empty, but which survivors insisted had once contained instruments of torture and experimentation. The psychological impact of these sightings on the community was profound and lasting, creating an atmosphere of persistent unease that made normal life difficult for residents who had hoped that Crawford's departure would allow them to rebuild their sense of security and normalcy. Children refused to play near the courthouse ruins. Adults altered their daily routines to avoid passing too close to the abandoned buildings, and even the most skeptical residents found themselves listening for sounds that might indicate the supernatural presence of their former tormentor. Dr. Hayes, whose medical practice had given him more insight into Crawford's activities than most residents possessed, became convinced that the judge's influence over Perdition Creek had not ended with his physical departure, but had instead been transformed into something more subtle and more persistent. Hayes observed that many of the community's residents continued to display symptoms of the fear and psychological trauma that had characterized life under Crawford's rule, as if the judge's presence had somehow been absorbed into the very atmosphere of the settlement. As years passed and Crawford's legend grew beyond the boundaries of Perdition Creek to become part of the broader folklore of frontier Texas, the question that continued to haunt those who remembered his reign of terror remained as disturbing as ever. Perhaps Crawford never left at all. Perhaps behind the walls that still stood as monuments to his cruelty, his gavel still falls, delivering sentences to victims who exist now only in the realm between life and death, where justice and vengeance have become indistinguishable and where the sound of chains dragging across limestone floors serves as an eternal reminder that some evils are too profound to be eliminated by the simple passage of time.